Okay, the purpose of these last few videos is to make sure that you have a really clear understanding of the nature of the last two budgets and the policies within the last two budgets to talk about for each particular goal. So first of all, you only need to know about the 2016-17 and 17-18 budgets. And the key thing you need to know from last year's budget is that the estimated deficit was $37.1 billion, which was slightly less than the year before, which was $39.9. So because it's a slightly smaller deficit, and these are the exact words you want to use, there's a smaller gap between the amount of injections relative to leakages. So there's a smaller gap between injections relative to leakages, which means that the budget is considered mildly contractionary. Whenever we have a smaller deficit, it's considered mildly contractionary because there's a smaller gap between injections and leakages, and therefore potentially it can have reduced the level of aggregate demand in the economy. Having said that, even though the smaller deficit implies a contractionary stance, the discretionary measures within the budget were expansionary, and this is the same for this year. So last year, the structural deficit actually increased by $5.5 billion, but because the economy was growing slightly faster, the automatic stabilisers, the deliberate policies within the government, made sure that the deficit got smaller. So we had slightly reduced unemployment compared to the year before, which meant that the cyclical component of the budget pushed us into a smaller deficit, while the structural component or the deliberate policies were quite expansionary. So the government basically have acknowledged that they're not going to rush the budget back to surplus. We have other issues, including this idea of fiscal consolidation, particularly as we start to diversify away from the mining boom. So they don't want to risk implementing too many harsh measures that are going to hurt our ability to grow in the long term. The other key thing to recognise, and whenever you get a graph, don't just talk about the size of the deficit, but also mention the percentage of GDP that the deficit is. So I'll show you a graph going forward. But last year, real GDP had increased. It went up from 3.1% from 2.5%, and the unemployment rate fell from 6% to 5.7%. Both of those factors helped to reduce the deficit. Okay, key policies from last year's budget. The key things you want to recognise: one, policy for full employment, the $840 million Youth Jobs Path Plan. Make sure you know each of those three steps. For strong and sustainable growth, remember the two things to be aware of is the decrease in the company tax rate, and explain how that impacts growth in both the short and long term, as well as the increase in the 32.5-cent tax bracket from 80,000 to 87,000. So we don't start paying 37 cents per dollar until we reach 87,000 instead of 80,000, which means that we save 4.5 cents between earning 80,000 and 87,000. That is good for all middle income earners and rich people within society. Your one goal for inflation or low inflation, it's the same as this year. It's the accelerated depreciation allowances. So when you claim an asset, so when you buy an asset worth up to $20,000, you can immediately depreciate that asset, which can be used to reduce your profits and therefore reduce your taxes that you pay at the end of the year. That incentivizes people to buy new assets and therefore makes sure that we are more productive in the long term as we invest in better productive assets. This year they extended this immediate depreciation allowance or tax write-off for another year, meaning that we can still claim that money back, so there's still an incentive to invest in better assets. Okay, one policy for full employment, one policy for strong and sustainable growth, one policy for low inflation. They're your three, and then, well, maybe two for growth. Policies that are getting us back into surplus or to achieve fiscal consolidation could include the excise tax on smokers of 12.5%, which is going up 12.5% for the next 3 years. That policy can also be used as a way to boost non-material living standards, as it helps to direct resources away from cigarettes and away from things that are going to cause things like lung cancer and emphysema, and as well as reducing the strain on our resources, our healthcare resources. Another thing they did is the multinational tax avoidance crackdown. So any firm that tries to shift their profits overseas will have to pay a 40% tax for trying to diverting their profits overseas, which will help the government to collect more money. The increase in the GST on online goods worth less than $1,000. So now things that you buy online that cost up to $1,000, you now have to pay GST on them as well. I wouldn't worry about freezing the Medicare because it was abolished this year. Okay, we'll talk about the parameters for this year's budget in the next one.